There is a place at the edge of the North American continent where the land runs out and the ocean takes over in a way that feels absolute and final. Not the gentle transition of a beach or a harbor, but a hard end, a cliff, a drop into water so cold and so deep that the usual categories of coastal and oceanic, shallow and deep, familiar and unknown, stop applying. This is Alaska, and what lies beneath its waters is one of the least understood marine environments on Earth. A world of cold and darkness and biological abundance that contradicts almost every assumption you might bring to it from the surface. The numbers are difficult to hold in the mind. Alaska's coastline, if you were to walk it, would stretch for more than 54,000 kilometers, longer than the entire coastline of the contiguous United States. The waters it borders encompass three distinct ocean systems: the Arctic Ocean to the north, the Pacific Ocean to the south, and between them, feeding both and fed by both, the Bering Sea. The Bering Sea alone covers more than 2 million square kilometers. It reaches depths of more than 4,000 meters in its western basins. It is one of the most biologically productive bodies of water on Earth, generating more seafood per square kilometer than almost any other ocean region. And beneath its surface, in water that rarely rises above 4 degrees Celsius, in a darkness that is absolute for months at a time, a world operates that we have barely begun to understand. If you could explore one of Earth's least understood oceans tonight, would you dare go beneath Alaska's waters? Tell us in the comments. If you enjoy drifting into the deep ocean and discovering what lies beneath, please consider liking and subscribing. It truly helps more than you know. Are you ready? Let's begin. The Bering Sea sits between two continents. To the east, Alaska. To the west, Siberia. At its narrowest point, the two land masses are separated by only 85 kilometers of open water. This strait, the Bering Strait, is one of the most consequential geographical features on Earth. During the last ice age, when global sea levels were roughly 60 to 90 meters lower than they are today, the Bering Strait was dry land. A bridge of exposed seabed, sometimes called Beringia, connected Asia to North America across what is now open ocean. Plants grew on it, animals crossed it. The ancestors of every indigenous American population walked across it, following the megafauna that had preceded them, entering a continent that no human being had ever set foot on. The land bridge is gone now, drowned by the rising seas that follow the end of the Ice Age. But the ocean that covers it is shallow, rarely more than 50 meters deep in the strait itself, a constant reminder that what is ocean today was something else entirely not long ago in geological terms. The shallowness of the northern Bering Sea has consequences that reach far beyond the strait itself. Shallow water is productive water. Sunlight penetrates to the seafloor. Nutrients circulate from bottom to surface with relative ease. The seafloor sediments of the northern Bering Sea are extraordinarily rich, accumulated over thousands of years of biological activity, compressed layers of the remains of organisms that lived and died in the water column above. These sediments are the foundation of a food web that extends from the smallest single-celled algae to the largest whales on Earth. A food web of extraordinary complexity and abundance that makes the Bering Sea one of the few remaining places where the ocean still functions at something close to its pre-industrial productivity. But the northern Bering Sea is only one part of the story. To the south, where the Aleutian Islands curve in a 1,900-kilometer arc from the Alaskan Peninsula toward the Kamchatka Peninsula of Russia, the seafloor drops away suddenly and dramatically. The continental shelf ends. The water deepens from hundreds of meters to thousands of meters in the space of a few kilometers. And along this edge, this dramatic transition from shallow productive shelf to deep open ocean, one of the most important ecological boundaries in the Pacific, operates. Cold, nutrient-rich water from the deep ocean upwells along this edge, feeding the surface and sustaining the biological abundance of the Bering Sea from below. The shelf edge is not merely a geographical feature. It is a pump, drawing deep water up into the sunlit zone and cycling the nutrients of the abyss back into the food web of the surface. South of the Aleutian Islands, the Pacific Ocean floor drops into one of the deepest and least explored submarine structures in the northern hemisphere. The Aleutian Trench runs parallel to the island arc for nearly 3,400 kilometers, curving from the Gulf of Alaska in the east to its junction with the Kuril-Kamchatka Trench in the west. At its deepest point, it reaches approximately 7,679 meters, making it one of the 10 deepest ocean trenches on Earth. The trench was formed by the same process that built the Aleutian volcanoes above it, the subduction of the Pacific Plate beneath the North American Plate. The oceanic crust of the Pacific, dense and cold and old, is diving beneath the lighter continental crust of Alaska, dragging the ocean floor down with it, creating the deep valley of the trench and, above the subduction zone, generating the magma that feeds the volcanoes of the Aleutian Arc. The Aleutian Trench is not merely deep, it is the engine of the entire Alaskan geological system. The earthquakes generated along its length are among the largest ever recorded. The 1,964 Good Friday earthquake, which struck off the coast of Prince William Sound, had a magnitude of 9.2, making it the second largest earthquake ever measured by a seismograph. It was caused by a sudden slip along the interface between the Pacific and North American plates, the same zone of contact that generates the trench. The earthquake lasted approximately 4 minutes. It displaced the seafloor over an area of roughly 250,000 square kilometers. It generated a tsunami that killed people as far away as Crescent City, California. It reshaped sections of the Alaskan coastline by as much as 11 meters vertically. The 1,964 earthquake is a reminder that the trench is not a passive geological feature. It is an active boundary between tectonic plates, releasing energy accumulated over decades in sudden, catastrophic events that affect everything above it. The biological communities of the Aleutian Trench are among the least studied of any major ocean trench. The technical difficulties of sampling at 7,000 meters depth, combined with the logistical challenges of operating research vessels in the remote and weather-volatile North Pacific, have meant that relatively few expeditions have targeted the trench specifically. What is known comes primarily from trawl surveys conducted at the upper slopes of the trench, from a small number of deep-sea camera deployments, and from the analysis of sediment cores. The picture that emerges is consistent with what deep-sea biology has found in other trenches. Microbial communities of extraordinary diversity and metabolic capability. Small crustaceans and worms adapted to the pressure and cold, and the slow rain of organic matter from the productive surface waters above, delivering energy to a system that cannot produce its own. What makes the Aleutian Trench biologically distinctive is its location. It sits beneath some of the most productive surface waters in the North Pacific. The Bering Sea and the Gulf of Alaska together represent one of the highest concentrations of marine biomass in the world. The organisms that live and die in these surface waters produce an enormous quantity of organic material that eventually sinks. Much of it is consumed in the water column before it reaches the deep, but a significant fraction reaches the trench floor, concentrated by the funnel geometry of the trench walls, delivering a richer supply of organic material to the Haddle Zone than a trench sitting beneath less productive waters would receive. The Aleutian Trench benefits from its position beneath the ocean's abundance. Its Haddle communities, though poorly documented, are likely more diverse and more productive than those of trenches in less fertile parts of the Pacific. The water itself connects the surface world to the deep in ways that are not immediately visible. Cold, dense water formed at the surface of the North Pacific, chilled by the Arctic air that sweeps across the Bering Sea in winter, sinks and flows southward and westward along the ocean floor, eventually joining the global circulation of deep water that connects every ocean basin on Earth. The deep water of the North Pacific is among the oldest in the world's oceans, water that has been circulating for more than 1,000 years since it last touched the surface. It carries with it the chemical signature of the surface conditions at the time it sank, a record of past temperatures and atmospheric compositions preserved in its dissolved gases and isotopic ratios. Reading that record requires sampling the deep water, bringing it to the surface, and analyzing it with precision instruments. The deep water of the Aleutian system has been sampled at relatively few points. What those samples have revealed has already reshaped understanding of North Pacific deepwater circulation. What the unsampled water holds remains unknown. The surface of the Bering Sea in winter is a place of extraordinary violence. Storms that develop in the Gulf of Alaska intensify as they track northwestward, driven by the temperature contrast between the cold Arctic air mass and the relatively warmer Pacific. These storms generate waves of 10 to 15 meters regularly, and occasionally considerably more. The sea ice that covers the northern Bering Sea from November through May is pushed and piled and broken by these storms into pressure ridges that can reach several meters in height, a chaotic landscape of fractured ice constantly in motion. None of this is visible from below. From beneath the ice, the storm is a distant sound, a low-frequency rumble transmitted through the water, and the ice above is a ceiling of diffuse white light, its undersurface textured with algae that grow on the ice itself and with the organisms that feed on those algae. The violence of the surface does not penetrate to the deep. What it does penetrate is the ice, and what grows on and under that ice is the beginning of everything that lives in the water below. The Bering Sea's productivity is not accidental. It is the result of a specific combination of physical conditions that exist in few other places on Earth. Shallow water over a broad continental shelf. Intense seasonal light in summer, with days that extend to 20 hours or more at high latitudes, nutrients delivered from the deep by upwelling along the shelf edge. Ice that melts in spring and releases the algae that have been growing on its underside throughout the winter, triggering a bloom of phytoplankton so intense that it can be seen from satellites as a spreading green stain across the surface of the sea. This spring bloom is the engine of everything. It produces organic matter at a rate that the rest of the food web cannot immediately consume, and the surplus sinks, carrying carbon and nutrients to the depths below, feeding the organisms on the shelf bottom and, eventually, those in the deeper water beyond the shelf edge. The spring bloom of the Bering Sea is one of the most productive biological events in the ocean. In the space of a few weeks in April and May, the surface water transforms from a clear, cold, nutrient-rich but largely lifeless expanse to a dense suspension of phytoplankton, zooplankton, and the organisms that feed on them. The water turns green. Fish schools converge from deep water. Seabirds arrive by the millions. Marine mammals follow. The bloom attracts everything that can reach it because it represents the year's primary pulse of energy, the moment when the sun returns and the ocean uses that energy to produce life at a rate that will not be matched again until the following spring. It lasts weeks. Then the nutrients are exhausted, the bloom collapses, and the organisms that fed on it either disperse or begin the long wait for the next year's light. What makes Alaska's ocean different from most other productive ocean regions is the combination of this surface abundance with a deep geological structure beneath it. The Aleutian Arc is not merely a chain of volcanic islands sitting on a stable seafloor. It is the surface expression of one of the most active tectonic boundaries on Earth, a boundary that creates the trench to the south, generates earthquakes and tsunamis, feeds the volcanoes above, and shapes the circulation of water throughout the North Pacific. The productivity of the surface and the geology of the deep are not separate stories. They are connected by the same tectonic forces that built the islands, carved the trench, and drove the upwelling that delivers deep water nutrients to the surface. Alaska's ocean is a single system, from the ice on the surface to the Haddle Zone, 7 kilometers below, and the connections between its parts run in both directions. What happens at the surface affects the deep. What happens at the deep affects the surface. And what happens along the tectonic boundary affects everything. The Aleutian Trench is not the end of the story. It is closer to the spine around which the whole story is organized. And to understand what lives in this water in all its extraordinary abundance and strange specificity, you have to start by understanding what lives closest to the surface, in the cold and the productivity and the seasonal extremes of Alaska's most visible ocean. The cold of the Bering Sea is not merely a physical condition. It is the organizing principle of the entire ecosystem. Cold water holds more dissolved oxygen than warm water. Cold water is denser than warm water, which drives the circulation that brings nutrients from the deep. Cold water slows metabolism, which means that the organisms living in it grow slowly and live long, accumulating biomass over years and decades rather than months. And cold water, in the specific context of the Bering Sea, is the condition that has shaped every organism in the system over millions of years of evolution, producing adaptations for cold tolerance, for energy storage in the form of dense fat reserves, for the exploitation of a food supply that is intensely seasonal and intermittently abundant rather than steady and predictable. The cold also connects Alaska's ocean to the rest of the global system in ways that are not immediately obvious. The North Pacific is one of the primary sources of the cold, dense, oxygen-rich water that sinks to the deep ocean and flows southward along the ocean floor, eventually upwelling in distant parts of the Pacific and Indian Oceans and returning nutrients to surface waters thousands of kilometers from where they sank. This thermohaline circulation, the global conveyor belt of ocean water driven by temperature and salinity differences, passes through Alaska's ocean. The water that sinks in the North Pacific today will upwell in the tropics centuries from now, carrying with it the dissolved gases and chemical signatures of the conditions that exist in the Bering Sea at this moment. Alaska's ocean is not a regional system. It is a component of the global one, and changes to its temperature, its salinity, its ice cover propagate through the global circulation with consequences that reach every ocean on Earth. The surface of the Bering Sea in winter, violent and cold and seemingly remote from everything else, is connected to the chemistry of the tropical Pacific and the productivity of the Indian Ocean by threads of water that move slowly and invisibly through the deep. What those threads carry from Alaska to the rest of the world is part of what makes Alaska's ocean matter far beyond its own shores. And what lives within that water, from the ice edge to the Haddle floor of the Aleutian Trench, is stranger and more various than almost any other comparable volume of ocean on Earth. There is one more dimension of Alaska's ocean that belongs in this opening account, one that sits at the intersection of geology and biology and history in a way that makes it unlike almost anything else in the marine world. The Bering Land Bridge, the drowned connection between Asia and North America, did not merely allow the passage of humans and megafauna. It shaped the marine biology of both the Pacific and Arctic oceans in ways that are still being studied. When the land bridge was exposed, it separated the Pacific from the Arctic, preventing the exchange of marine species between the two ocean systems. When it was submerged, it reconnected them, allowing species to move in both directions and creating the complex mixture of Pacific and Arctic marine fauna that characterizes the Bering Sea today. The shallow seafloor of the northern Bering Sea, where the land bridge once was, is a biological mixing zone, a place where organisms of Pacific origin and organisms of Arctic origin meet and compete and sometimes interbreed, producing the genetic diversity that makes the Bering Sea ecosystem unusually resilient to environmental change. The history of the land bridge is written in the genetics of the organisms that live in the water above it, a molecular record of migration and isolation and reconnection that spans the last glacial cycle. The ocean does not forget. It keeps its records in the DNA of its inhabitants, in the sediment on its floor, in the chemistry of its deep water. And what those records reveal about the creatures that have evolved in this particular cold, this particular darkness, this particular abundance, is a story that begins not with the geology or the circulation, but with the animals themselves. The red king crab, Paralithodes kamtschaticus, is not a subtle animal. It reaches a leg span of nearly 1.8 meters. It weighs up to 12 kilograms. Its shell is armored with sharp spines that deter predators and make handling it, for the fishermen who pursue it, a genuinely dangerous undertaking. It walks across the seafloor on 4 pairs of legs, with a 5th pair modified into small paddles tucked under the shell, moving with a deliberateness that belies its size. It lives primarily at depths between 20 and 200 meters in the Bering Sea and Gulf of Alaska, migrating seasonally between deeper and shallower water in aggregations that can number in the millions. When those aggregations move, they move as a mass, crabs pressing against crabs, a slow-rolling carpet of shell and leg crossing the seafloor in a migration that has been occurring in this ocean for millions of years, and that the industrial fishing industry discovered only in the 20th century. The red king crab is the reason Alaska became synonymous with dangerous fishing in the popular imagination. The Bering Sea crab fishery, which targets red king crab and several related species, is conducted in winter when the crabs are in shallower water and therefore more accessible to crab pots lowered from the surface. Winter in the Bering Sea means storms, ice, waves that can exceed 10 meters, and air temperatures that freeze spray to rigging faster than a crew can clear it. The boats that fish it are small by industrial standards, typically 30 to 45 meters long, operating in conditions that would ground aircraft and keep most ships in port. The mortality rate among Bering Sea crab fishermen was, for much of the 20th century, the highest of any occupation in the United States. It has declined significantly with the introduction of mandatory safety measures, but the fishery remains one of the most physically demanding commercial operations on Earth. What drives it is the crab itself, an animal of remarkable size and commercial value that exists in this ocean in quantities that exist nowhere else on Earth. Why does the red king crab reach the size it does? The answer involves the same principles that produce deep-sea gigantism more broadly, applied to the specific conditions of the cold North Pacific. Cold water slows metabolism and extends lifespan. The red king crab grows slowly, reaching sexual maturity at approximately 5 years of age and continuing to grow throughout its life, molting its shell annually when young and less frequently as it ages. Individuals may live for 20 to 30 years in the wild, accumulating size over decades in a way that warmer water crustaceans, with their faster metabolisms and shorter lives, cannot. The cold of the Bering Sea is the enabling condition. Without it, the red king crab would be a smaller, shorter-lived, less ecologically dominant animal. With it, it becomes the largest commercially harvested crustacean in North American waters, and one of the signature organisms of the Alaskan ecosystem. The red king crab's biology is more complex than its size suggests. It is an omnivore, feeding on worms, clams, mussels, sea urchins, brittle stars, sponges, and other organisms it encounters on the seafloor. Its feeding is not selective in the way that a specialized predator's feeding is selective. It processes whatever it encounters with a mouthpart structure adapted for handling a wide variety of food types. This dietary flexibility is part of what makes it so ecologically important. The red king crab functions as a significant regulator of benthic community composition, suppressing the populations of the organisms it eats, and in turn being suppressed by its own predators, primarily Pacific cod and Pacific halibut, which consume juvenile crabs before their shells harden. The crab is simultaneously predator and prey, a middle node in a food web of extraordinary complexity. The giant Pacific octopus, Enteroctopus doflini, occupies a different position in Alaska's ocean and represents a different kind of size. It is the largest octopus species in the world, reaching arm spans of up to 4.3 meters and weights of up to 71 kilograms in the largest verified specimens. It lives throughout the North Pacific, from Alaska to Japan, at depths ranging from the intertidal zone to several hundred meters. In Alaskan waters, it is found in rocky reef environments, in kelp forests, in the boulder fields of the Gulf of Alaska, and in the deeper soft sediment environments of the continental shelf. It is a predator of considerable capability, capable of capturing and consuming prey ranging from small crustaceans to fish to, reportedly, small sharks. Its primary prey in Alaskan waters includes Dungeness crabs, clams, scallops, and fish, which it hunts using a combination of chemoreception through sensory cells in its suckers and vision through eyes that are among the most sophisticated in the invertebrate world. The giant Pacific octopus's intelligence is well documented and genuinely remarkable. Laboratory studies have demonstrated that it can solve puzzles, navigate mazes, recognize individual human handlers by sight, and open containers with twist-off lids. These cognitive abilities are not incidental to its ecology. In the wild, the octopus uses problem-solving to open bivalves with tightly sealed shells, to navigate complex reef environments in search of prey, and to construct and modify the dens it occupies, piling rocks and shell debris at the entrance to create a defended space that it maintains and returns to. The den is not merely a hiding place. It is a territory, maintained against competitors and predators, and in the case of a brooding female, a nursery in which she tends her eggs for months without leaving to feed, dying of starvation after her eggs hatch. The giant Pacific octopus lives for only 3 to 5 years, a lifespan that seems short for an animal of its cognitive complexity, and one that makes the investment of the female in her eggs all the more striking. She has one reproductive event in her life. She gives everything to it. The Pacific halibut, Hippoglossus stenolepis, is the largest flatfish in the world and one of the most consequential fish in Alaskan waters. It reaches lengths of up to 2.7 meters and weights of up to 320 kilograms, though fish of that size are rare today due to fishing pressure. Its body plan is a result of a developmental process that begins with a conventionally shaped larval fish and ends with an adult that is essentially sideways, both eyes on one side of the head, the underside white and the upper side dark, in a coloration pattern that provides camouflage against both the lit water above and the dark seafloor below. The halibut lies on the bottom and ambushes prey that passes over it, striking upward with surprising speed for an animal of its size. It is an ambush predator at the top of the benthic food web, consuming whatever the Bering Sea produces at the seafloor level, from small fish and squid to crabs and other invertebrates. The halibut's life history reflects the cold water pattern of slow growth and long life. Females grow significantly larger than males and live longer, with some individuals reaching ages of 55 years or more. A 300 kilogram female halibut is an animal that has been living on the floor of the North Pacific for half a century, accumulating mass slowly in cold water, surviving the predation pressure of its early years to reach a size at which very few things can threaten it. The Pacific halibut is also a remarkable migrant, moving hundreds to thousands of kilometers between its spawning grounds in deep water off the continental shelf and its summer feeding areas on the shallow continental shelf. Tagged halibut have been recovered more than 3,000 kilometers from where they were released. The Bering Sea is not simply where they live. It is one stop on a circuit that encompasses a significant portion of the North Pacific. The stellar sea lion, Eumetopias jubatus, is the largest member of the family Otariidae, the eared seals, and one of the dominant marine predators of Alaskan coastal waters. Adult males reach lengths of up to 3.3 meters and weights of up to 1,120 kilograms, making them among the largest pinnipeds on Earth. They haul out on rocky shores and offshore islands throughout the Gulf of Alaska and Bering Sea, forming colonies of hundreds to thousands of individuals that are audible and olfactorily detectable from considerable distances. In the water, they are transformed. The bulk that makes them ungainly on land becomes an asset in the sea, where their large bodies retain heat in cold water, where their powerful flippers propel them at speeds sufficient to catch pollock and herring and cod, and where their size gives them access to prey items that smaller seals cannot handle. The stellar sea lion's decline through the latter half of the 20th century is one of the most consequential and debated events in North Pacific marine ecology. Between the 1970s and the 1990s, the population of stellar sea lions in the western Gulf of Alaska and Bering Sea declined by approximately 80%. The causes are still disputed. Commercial fishing for pollock, the primary prey of the sea lion in many parts of its range, was fingered early as the likely culprit through a mechanism called nutritional stress. The removal of pollock by fishing fleets, leaving less food available for sea lions, particularly nursing females and growing pups. Other hypotheses include killer whale predation, disease, entanglement in fishing gear, and shifts in the distribution of prey species driven by oceanographic changes. Most likely, the decline resulted from a combination of factors operating simultaneously. What the decline demonstrated was the degree to which the large predators of Alaska's ocean are dependent on the integrity of the food web below them, and how quickly that integrity can be disrupted by changes to the abundance of a single prey species. The creatures of Alaska's ocean are not simply large. They are large in ways that are specific to this particular environment, shaped by its cold and its productivity and its seasonal extremes into forms and behaviors that have no equivalent elsewhere. The red king crab's annual migration is tuned to the timing of the Bering Sea's productivity cycle. The giant Pacific octopus's reproductive strategy is calibrated to the lifespan that the cold allows. The halibut circuit between spawning grounds and feeding areas maps the geography of the North Pacific in a way that reflects millions of years of learning where the food is and when. And all of these animals, the crab and the octopus and the halibut and the sea lion, are connected to each other and to the organisms below them by relationships of predation and competition and dependence that extend downward through the water column into zones that most of them never visit, but that sustain everything. Above, what lies beneath all of this, beneath the food web and the migrations and the predator-prey relationships, is a geological reality that most of these animals never encounter, but that made every one of them possible. The walrus, Audubonus rosmarus, deserves its own moment of attention because it occupies a niche in Alaska's ocean that no other large animal fills. Adult males reach lengths of 3.6 meters and weights of up to 1,700 kilograms, making them among the heaviest pinnipeds on Earth. Their most distinctive feature, the elongated canine teeth that form the tusks, can reach lengths of up to a meter in large males and serve functions that are not primarily predatory. The tusks are used for hauling out onto ice, for establishing social dominance among males, and for breaking breathing holes in ice. They are social instruments as much as physical ones, displays of condition and competitive ability that other walruses assess in determining the outcome of social interactions. But the walrus's most distinctive ecological role is its diet. It feeds almost exclusively on benthic invertebrates, primarily bivalve mollusks, which it locates by dragging its sensitive whiskers across the seafloor and excavates using jets of water from its mouth. A single walrus can consume thousands of clams in a single feeding bout. The collective impact of a herd of walruses on a section of Bering Sea seafloor is substantial, disturbing the sediment, releasing nutrients, and restructuring the invertebrate community in ways that create habitat for other species. The walrus is not merely a consumer. It is an ecosystem engineer, reshaping the seafloor it feeds on. The Pacific cod, Gadus macrocephalus, is not the largest or the most dramatic animal in Alaska's ocean, but it is arguably the most ecologically central. It reaches lengths of up to 1.2 meters and weights of up to 22 kilograms, and it exists in the Bering Sea and Gulf of Alaska in quantities that make it the foundation of the commercial fishing industry and a critical link in the food web. Pacific cod are generalist predators, consuming a wide variety of prey, including pollock, herring, capelin, squid, and invertebrates. They are in turn consumed by almost everything larger than themselves: halibut, marine mammals, seabirds. They occupy the middle of the food web in a way that gives them disproportionate importance. Remove Pacific cod from Alaska's ocean, and the ecosystem does not simply lose one species. It loses the species that connects the lower and upper trophic levels, and the consequences cascade in both directions. The organisms that cod prey on erupt. The organisms that prey on cod decline. The food web reorganizes around a gap that cod had occupied for millennia. The biological richness of Alaska's coastal ocean is sustained by a physical process that operates continuously and invisibly beneath the surface. The mixing of water masses, the convergence of Pacific and Arctic water in the Bering Sea, the upwelling along the shelf edge, the tidal mixing that stirs nutrients off the seafloor in shallow areas. All of these processes deliver the chemical raw materials of life to the sunlit zone where photosynthesis can use them. Without this physical delivery system, the biological abundance of Alaska's ocean would not be possible. The organisms we have been describing, the crab and the octopus and the halibut and the cod and the walrus and the sea lion, are all ultimately dependent on the physics of the water column, on the circulation patterns that bring nutrients from the deep, on the seasonal dynamics of ice formation and melt that structure the entire annual cycle of productivity. They are the visible expression of invisible processes, the biological output of a physical system of extraordinary complexity. And that physical system is changing. The temperatures of the Bering Sea have risen measurably in recent decades. The biological consequences of that change are already visible in the populations of the organisms that depend on the conditions the cold has always provided. What those consequences mean for the deeper systems that sustain them is a question that the ocean has not yet fully answered. The orca, or killer whale, Orcinus orca, is the apex predator of Alaska's ocean, and its presence in these waters illustrates something important about how the entire ecosystem is organized. Orcas in Alaskan waters exist in two ecologically distinct forms that do not interbreed and have different diets, different social structures, different acoustic repertoires, and different ranges. Resident orcas eat fish, primarily salmon, and are highly social, living in stable family groups that maintain lifelong associations. Transient orcas, also called Bigg's killer whales, eat marine mammals, hunting seals, sea lions, and even large whales in coordinated group attacks. The two forms share the same waters but occupy different ecological niches, a level of ecological specialization that is unusual in a single species and that reflects the extraordinary productivity of Alaska's ocean. There is enough food in these waters to support two distinct forms of the same predator, each specialized for a different prey type, each occupying a different position in the food web, each contributing differently to the structure of the ecosystem. The transient orcas' predation on stellar sea lions has been proposed as one contributor to the sea lion's decline in the western Gulf of Alaska. The hypothesis, called the sequential megafauna collapse hypothesis, suggests that the reduction of large whale populations by commercial whaling in the mid-20th century deprived transient orcas of their preferred prey and caused them to shift to smaller marine mammals, first stellar sea lions, then harbor seals, then sea otters, in a cascade of predator-induced population declines that restructured the coastal ecosystem of the North Pacific. The hypothesis is controversial, and the evidence for it is mixed. But it illustrates the degree to which Alaska's ocean is an integrated system in which changes to one component propagate through the others in ways that are difficult to predict and harder to reverse. The orca is not simply the top predator in a linear food chain. It is a node in a web connected to everything below it, and when it changes its behavior, the web responds. Alaska's ocean is vast and cold and seemingly inexhaustible, but it is also connected in every part to every other part by relationships of dependence and predation and competition that have been refined over millions of years, and that the changes of the past century have begun in ways we are only starting to understand, to unravel. Below the surface, where these animals hunt and feed and compete, in the volcanic geology of the seafloor and the darkness of the Aleutian Trench, the forces that built this system are still active. The Aleutian Islands are one of the great geological accidents of the North Pacific. Stretching 1,900 kilometers from the tip of the Alaska Peninsula toward the Kamchatka Peninsula of Russia in a curving arc of more than 300 volcanic islands, islets, and underwater seamounts, they represent the surface expression of one of the most active volcanic systems on Earth. Approximately 40 of the Aleutian volcanoes have erupted since the mid-18th century, when European explorers first began documenting them. Some erupt with such regularity that their activity has become a baseline condition, noted only when it exceeds the normal level of steam and ash emission. Others have produced eruptions of genuine violence, sending ash clouds into the stratosphere and lava flows into the sea. The islands themselves are geologically young, built by volcanic activity over the past few million years on a foundation of oceanic crust that is being dragged into the mantle by the subduction of the Pacific Plate. They are not permanent features. They are the temporary surface expression of a process that has been ongoing for tens of millions of years and that will continue long after the current islands have been eroded to seamounts. What makes the Aleutian volcanic system remarkable is not the volcanoes above the waterline, it is what happens below it. For every island visible at the surface, there are multiple volcanic structures entirely submerged, seamounts and calderas and lava fields that built up from the seafloor and stopped short of the surface, or that once extended above the water and were eroded back below it. The underwater topography of the Aleutian Arc is extraordinarily complex. A landscape of peaks and valleys and lava flows and hydrothermal fields that covers thousands of square kilometers of seafloor at depths ranging from a few meters to several thousand. This topography creates habitat diversity on a scale that has no equivalent on the relatively flat abyssal plains of the deep Pacific. Ridges and peaks force currents upward, bringing nutrients from the deep. Calderas create enclosed basins with their own distinct chemical environments. Hydrothermal vents deliver chemical energy to the seafloor in locations distributed throughout the arc. The hydrothermal vent systems of the Aleutian Arc are less famous than those of the East Pacific Rise or the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, but they are scientifically significant precisely because of their location. The Aleutian Arc vents exist at the intersection of subduction zone, volcanism, and cold, highly productive surface waters, a combination that creates vent systems with unusual chemistry and unusual biological communities. Subduction zone hydrothermal vents are chemically different from mid-ocean ridge vents because the fluids circulating through the volcanic rock are influenced by the materials carried down by the subducting plate. The sediment and the altered oceanic crust descending with the Pacific Plate carry water, organic compounds, and chemical elements that are released at depth and influence the composition of the hydrothermal fluids that eventually vent at the seafloor. The result is vent chemistry that differs from other systems in ways that are reflected in the biological communities that depend on it. Hydrothermal vent communities along the Aleutian Arc have been studied at several locations, including the arc segment near the Mariana Arc, where tectonic conditions are similar to the Aleutian system. What has been found consistently is that subduction zone vents support biological communities that are compositionally different from mid-ocean ridge vent communities, with different dominant species and different patterns of diversity, reflecting the different chemical environment created by the subduction process. At the Aleutian Arc, specifically, vent communities remain incompletely characterized. The logistical challenges of operating research submersibles in the remote and storm-prone North Pacific, combined with the limited number of expeditions that have targeted Aleutian seamounts and calderas, mean that much of the system remains unexplored. What is being observed in the limited surveys conducted suggests high biological diversity and the presence of species found nowhere else, a pattern consistent with the level of geological distinctiveness of the system. The volcanic islands themselves create a different kind of habitat in the shallow water immediately surrounding them. The rocky reefs around the Aleutian Islands are among the most diverse and productive in the North Pacific, supporting kelp forests, cold water coral communities, and an extraordinary variety of fish and invertebrate species. The cold, nutrient-rich water upwelled by the interaction of currents with the island topography sustains algal growth at rates that build food webs of considerable complexity. The Aleutian Islands are a biodiversity hotspot in a part of the ocean that is already unusually productive. The rocky reefs concentrating and amplifying the biological richness of the surrounding water in the way that any complex three-dimensional structure does in an otherwise two-dimensional environment. The cold water corals of the Aleutian Islands are particularly significant. Unlike tropical corals, which depend on photosynthetic symbiotic algae and require warm, clear water, cold water corals of genera including Primnoa, Paragorgia, and related species are filter feeders that can grow at depths of several hundred to several thousand meters in complete darkness and near freezing temperatures wherever current conditions bring sufficient food. The Aleutian coral reefs, some of them centuries to millennia old, form three-dimensional reef structures that provide habitat for dozens of species of fish and invertebrates. They are slow-growing and fragile. Bottom trawling, a fishing technique that drags weighted nets across the seafloor, has damaged Aleutian coral reefs significantly in areas where it has been conducted. The damage is not recoverable on any human timescale. A coral structure that took 1,000 years to build is gone after a single trawl pass, and the biological community it supported is displaced or destroyed. The Aleutian Islands were designated a no-trawl zone for bottom fishing in 2006, one of the largest marine protected areas in U.S. waters. Whether the protection is sufficient and whether it is effectively enforced remains an ongoing question. The seismic activity of the Aleutian Arc is inseparable from its biology. Earthquakes in the region are frequent and sometimes very large. The same subduction process that builds the volcanoes and creates the hydrothermal vents also generates earthquakes along the interface between the Pacific and North American plates, some of them capable of producing devastating tsunamis. The biological consequences of large earthquakes in the Aleutian region extend beyond the immediate physical disruption. Strong seismic shaking triggers submarine landslides on the slopes of the Aleutian volcanoes and along the walls of the Aleutian Trench, delivering concentrated pulses of organic material and sediment to deeper water. These turbidity currents, underwater avalanches of sediment, reset the biological communities on the surfaces they overrun and create new patches of disturbed seafloor that are colonized by pioneering species. Seismicity is not merely a geological hazard in the Aleutian system. It is a driver of ecological dynamics, periodically resetting portions of the seafloor and creating the habitat heterogeneity that supports biodiversity. The Aleutian Arc is also the site of one of the largest and most consequential volcanic eruptions of the past century. The 1,912 eruption of Nova Rupta volcano on the Alaska Peninsula at the eastern end of the Aleutian Arc was the largest volcanic eruption of the 20th century, expelling approximately 30 cubic kilometers of volcanic material over 60 hours. The eruption created the Valley of 10,000 Smokes, a landscape of ash and pumice flows that buried the Yukok River Valley under up to 200 meters of volcanic debris. It darkened skies across the northern hemisphere. Its effects on the marine environment of the surrounding waters are less well documented, but were certainly significant, with volcanic ash fallout altering the chemistry and biology of the surface ocean over a wide area. The eruption is a reminder that the volcanoes of the Aleutian Arc are not merely geological curiosities. They are active geological forces capable of affecting the ocean system on regional and global scales. The interaction between the volcanic geology of the Aleutian Arc and the biological communities that inhabit it creates a system of unusual complexity. The hard substrates provided by volcanic rock support communities that would not exist on soft sediment. The chemical energy released by hydrothermal systems supports organisms that do not depend on sunlight. The topographic complexity created by the seamounts and calderas and lava flows concentrates currents and nutrients in ways that amplify the productivity of the surrounding water. And the seismic activity that is an inevitable consequence of the subduction process periodically disturbs and resets those communities, maintaining the habitat heterogeneity that supports biodiversity. The Aleutian Arc is not simply a chain of volcanic islands. It is a biological engine, converting geological energy into ecological diversity, producing in the process some of the most unusual and least studied marine communities in the Pacific. What drives that engine, what ultimately powers the entire system from the deepest hydrothermal vent to the surface bloom, is the same subduction process that built the Arc and carved the trench and generated every earthquake that has ever shaken these islands. And the full story of what Alaska's ocean contains has not yet been told. The Arc is one chapter, while the Arctic darkness and the seasonal extremes of the most remote waters produce is another. The seamounts of the Aleutian Arc deserve more attention than they typically receive in popular accounts of Alaskan marine biology. A seamount is an underwater mountain, typically of volcanic origin, that rises from the seafloor without breaking the surface. The Aleutian Arc has dozens of them, distributed along the length of the arc at various depths, each one a distinct habitat with its own current patterns, its own substrate types, its own biological community. Seamounts concentrate biodiversity for the same reason that islands concentrate biodiversity on land. They provide habitat complexity and isolation that promotes speciation and endemism. Species found on one Aleutian seamount may not be found on another. The degree of endemism, species found nowhere else, is likely high in the Aleutian seamount system, but quantifying it requires sampling that has barely begun. The physical oceanography around seamounts is distinctive and ecologically important. When deep ocean currents encounter a seamount, they are deflected upward, creating an upwelling of cold, nutrient-rich water on the downstream side of the peak. This upwelling sustains phytoplankton growth and concentrates zooplankton and fish in ways that make seamounts disproportionately productive relative to the surrounding open ocean. Seamount fisheries, targeting species that aggregate over the peaks, have been among the most intensively exploited fisheries in the world, often with catastrophic results. The orange roughy fisheries of the Southern Ocean targeted seamount aggregations and collapsed within years of their discovery because the fish being caught were decades to a century old and could not reproduce fast enough to replace the removed individuals. The Aleutian seamounts have not experienced comparable exploitation, partly because of their remoteness, partly because the dominant species on them, cold water corals and associated invertebrates, are not commercial targets. But the pressure exists, and the history of seamount fisheries elsewhere is a warning about what happens when remoteness is no longer a reliable protection. The volcanic history of the Aleutian Arc is also a story about what happens to the ocean when a large eruption occurs. The ash from Aleutian eruptions falls into some of the most biologically productive waters in the North Pacific. Volcanic ash contains iron and other trace elements that are limiting nutrients for phytoplankton in the iron-poor surface waters of the North Pacific. When ash falls into these waters, it can trigger phytoplankton blooms by delivering iron in a form that algae can readily absorb. The ecological consequences of these iron fertilization events are complex and not fully understood. A bloom triggered by volcanic ash may increase biological productivity in the short term, drawing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as the phytoplankton grow. But the downstream effects on the food web and on deep water chemistry depend on which species bloom. How much of the bloom sinks rather than being consumed in the surface food web, and what happens to the organic matter that does sink. The Aleutian Arc is, among its many other roles, a periodic fertilizer of the North Pacific surface ocean, its eruptions delivering trace elements that amplify productivity in ways that have been occurring throughout the geological history of the arc. The North Pacific is iron limited, meaning that the availability of dissolved iron in the surface water is the primary constraint on phytoplankton growth across much of the basin. This iron limitation is the reason that large areas of the central North Pacific, despite having sufficient light and macronutrients, support relatively little biological productivity. The Aleutian Islands and the volcanic activity associated with them are one of several natural sources of iron to the North Pacific surface ocean, alongside dust transport from the Asian continent, river inputs from Alaskan rivers, and upwelling of iron-rich deep water along the shelf edge. The relative importance of these different iron sources varies seasonally and geographically, and has been a subject of considerable scientific interest, because The iron fertilization of the North Pacific has implications for the biological pump, for the uptake of atmospheric carbon dioxide by the ocean, and for the long-term regulation of atmospheric carbon dioxide on geological timescales. The Aleutian Arc is not merely a local geological feature. It is part of the global carbon cycle, contributing iron to surface waters that drive photosynthesis, that removes carbon from the atmosphere and carries it to the deep ocean when the organisms that fixed it die and sink. The biology of the Aleutian Arc is ultimately a story about the consequences of living at the intersection of multiple environmental gradients. The organisms that inhabit the arc, from the cold water corals on the seamount peaks, to the hydrothermal vent communities in the calderas, to the kelp forests in the shallow reef zones, all live at the junction of volcanic geology and cold, productive ocean, of deep water chemistry and surface water biology, of tectonic activity and ecological stability. None of these gradients is stable. The volcanoes erupt periodically. The earthquakes reset portions of the seafloor. The currents shift with the seasons and with longer-term climate variations. The organisms that persist in this environment are those that can tolerate or exploit the variability, those that have evolved to take advantage of the disturbances that other organisms cannot survive. The Aleutian Arc selects for resilience in a way that few other marine environments do, and the communities it produces are unusual in their composition and their adaptability. What is unknown is how they will respond to the changes that are coming. As the ocean warms and acidifies and the ice patterns of the North Pacific shift in ways that have not been seen in the historical record of human observation, there is one geological feature of the Aleutian Arc that connects its surface biology directly to the deepest parts of the system, and that deserves mention before we move on. The volcanic calderas that form when large eruptions empty their magma chambers and the overlying structure collapses can create enclosed basins on the seafloor, sometimes at considerable depth, with water chemistry that is influenced by the ongoing hydrothermal activity within the caldera walls. Kasatochi Island, one of the Aleutian Islands, produced a large eruption in 2008 that buried its entire surface ecosystem under meters of ash. The recovery of biological communities on the island and in the surrounding shallow water was rapid and is being studied as a natural experiment in colonization and succession. But the deeper caldera structures associated with Aleutian volcanism, some of them entirely submerged, have been much less thoroughly investigated. They represent enclosed chemical environments that may harbor biological communities found nowhere else, products of the specific volcanic chemistry of this particular arc in this particular part of the Pacific. They are, in every meaningful sense, unexplored. And unexplored in Alaska's ocean is not an unusual condition. It is the default. The arc has more unknown than known, more unvisited than visited, more undescribed than described. The volcanoes are visible. What they have built beneath the surface over millions of years of eruption and collapse and hydrothermal activity is mostly still waiting to be found. The Arctic Ocean that borders Alaska to the north is one of the least understood bodies of water on Earth. It is also one of the most rapidly changing. The sea ice that covers much of it for most of the year is not merely frozen water. It is a habitat, a physical structure that supports biological communities from its undersurface to its interior to its surface. Communities that have evolved over millions of years in close dependence on the ice and that have no equivalent anywhere else in the ocean. Beneath the ice, in water that hovers near the freezing point of seawater, which is lower than the freezing point of fresh water due to its salt content, organisms have solved the problem of cold in ways that are as remarkable as anything the deep ocean has produced. They have done so in an environment that is now changing faster than any other on Earth, and the consequences of that change are still unfolding in ways that science has only begun to track. Sea ice forms when the surface of the ocean cools to approximately minus 1.8 degrees Celsius, the freezing point of seawater at typical Arctic salinity. The process is not instantaneous. Ice crystals, called fragile ice, form first in the water column, rising to the surface and consolidating into a layer called grease ice, which has the consistency and appearance of gray slush. As temperatures continue to drop, the grease ice thickens and hardens into pancake ice, circular disks of ice that form when waves break the consolidating surface into pieces that collide and develop raised edges from the repeated impacts. Eventually, in calm conditions, the pancakes freeze together into continuous sheet ice that thickens through the winter as cold continues to extract heat from the water below. By late winter, sea ice in the northern Bering Sea and Chukchi Sea may be 1 to 2 meters thick, with pressure ridges where ice sheets have collided reaching several meters in height. The underside of the sea ice is not a flat, featureless surface. It is textured by the same processes that create the pressure ridges visible above, with protruding keels of ice extending downward several meters below the main ice surface. These keels create three-dimensional structure in what would otherwise be a flat boundary between ice and water, and that structure supports biological communities in the same way that the rock surfaces of the Aleutian reef systems support communities, by providing attachment surfaces and complex microhabitats. The organisms that colonize the underside of sea ice are collectively called sea ice fauna, and they include bacteria, single-celled algae called ice algae, protists, nematode worms, amphipod crustaceans, and the larvae of larger organisms that use the ice underside as a nursery. The ice algae that grow on and within the ice are the primary producers at the base of the entire Arctic food web, fixing carbon through photosynthesis using the light that filters through the ice above, and they do this in temperatures that would inhibit photosynthesis in most plants. The ice algae's ability to photosynthesize at temperatures near freezing and at light levels that are a fraction of what surface algae receive is one of the most remarkable adaptations in the polar ocean. It depends on several biochemical modifications to the standard photosynthetic machinery, including cell membranes enriched in polyunsaturated fatty acids that remain fluid at low temperatures, antifreeze proteins that prevent ice crystal formation within cells, and photosynthetic pigments that can capture the wavelengths of light that penetrate through ice most efficiently. These adaptations have been refined over millions of years in an environment that has been cold and icy for much of its geological history, and they produce organisms that are exquisitely specialized for conditions that very few other photosynthetic organisms can tolerate. The ice algae are not merely surviving in their environment. They have been shaped by it into something that exists nowhere else. The spring melt of the sea ice is one of the most biologically significant events in the Arctic. As temperatures rise and daylight hours increase, the ice surface begins to melt, and the meltwater, which is less dense than seawater, pools on top of the ice and eventually drains through it, carrying nutrients and organic matter into the water column below. Simultaneously, the melting ice releases the ice algae that have been growing on and within it throughout the winter, delivering a concentrated pulse of organic matter to the water column at exactly the moment when increasing daylight makes a phytoplankton bloom possible. The combination of released ice algae, meltwater stratified surface layer, and increasing light triggers one of the most intense and rapidly developing biological events in the ocean. The Arctic spring bloom can develop from essentially zero to maximum biomass in a matter of days, far faster than temperate ocean blooms, because the nutrients have been accumulating through the winter and the conditions for growth change abruptly rather than gradually. Below the ice, in the water column of the Chukchi Sea and the Beaufort Sea, the Arctic Ocean adjacent to Alaska, organisms have evolved physiological and behavioral strategies for surviving the darkness and cold of the polar winter. Many simply slow down. Arctic copepods of the genus Calanus, the tiny crustaceans that form the foundation of the Arctic zooplankton food web, spend the winter in a state of diapause, sinking to depths of several hundred meters, reducing their metabolic rate to a minimum, and living off the fat reserves they accumulated during the summer feeding season. These fat reserves, which can constitute more than half the copepod's dry weight, are the storage mechanism that allows them to survive months without food. They are also the energy packets that fuel everything above them in the food web, because when the copepods ascend in spring and are consumed by fish and seabirds and marine mammals, the fat they carry passes up the food chain. The fatty acid composition of Arctic marine organisms, enriched in polyunsaturated fatty acids like omega-3s, reflects this dependence on copepod fat as the primary energy currency of the Arctic food web. The Arctic cod, Boreogodus sida, is the keystone fish species of Alaska's Arctic waters, occupying the same central position in the Arctic food web that Pacific cod occupies in the Bering Sea. It is a small fish, typically 20 to 30 centimeters long, but it exists in enormous quantities under and around sea ice throughout the Arctic Ocean. Arctic cod feed primarily on copepods and other zooplankton and are in turn consumed by ringed seals, bearded seals, beluga whales, narwhals, and seabirds, including thick-billed murres. The entire Arctic marine mammal community in Alaskan waters is built on a foundation of Arctic cod, and the Arctic cod is built on a foundation of the ice algae and copepods that the ice supports. Remove the sea ice, and the entire structure shifts. The ice algae decline. The copepods that depend on the ice algae decline. The Arctic cod that depend on the copepods decline. And the seals and whales and bears that depend on the Arctic cod decline with them. The sea ice is not merely a physical feature of the Arctic environment. It is the structural foundation of the Arctic food web, the platform on which the entire biological system is built. The ringed seal, Pusa hispida, is the most abundant marine mammal in the Arctic and the primary prey of the polar bear. It is also the marine mammal most directly dependent on sea ice for its survival. Ringed seals give birth in snow layers, small cavities excavated in the snow above breathing holes in the sea ice, where the pups are sheltered from the cold and from predators. The pups are born with a thick white coat of lanugo that insulates them for the first weeks of life, before they molt into the darker adult coat and begin learning to swim. The survival of ringed seal pups depends on the persistence of sea ice through the spring pupping season. If the ice breaks up early, before the pups are weaned and capable of independent survival in the water, the survival rate collapses. The ringed seal is the indicator species for the consequences of sea ice decline, because its reproductive success is directly and immediately tied to the timing of the ice, with no buffer and no alternative strategy. The polar bear, Ursus maritimus, is the predator at the apex of the Arctic food web, and its dependence on sea ice is as direct as the ringed seals. Polar bears hunt seals by waiting at breathing holes in the ice, or by stalking seals hauled out on ice surfaces. They are capable swimmers, but they are not marine mammals in the physiological sense. They cannot catch seals in open water with the efficiency required to sustain a large body through the Arctic winter. Their survival depends on access to sea ice during the period when ringed seals are pupping and accessible. As the extent and duration of sea ice in the Beaufort and Chukchi seas has declined over the past 4 decades, polar bears in Alaskan waters have been forced to spend longer periods on land, fasting, while waiting for the ice to form in autumn. The body condition of polar bears in the southern Beaufort Sea population has declined measurably. The reproductive rate has declined. The population has decreased. The polar bear is not merely a symbol of Arctic climate change. It is an accurate biological indicator of a transformation in the physical environment that is happening faster than the organisms that depend on it can adapt. The narwhal, Monodon monoceros, is an animal so peculiar in its appearance that it was dismissed as a myth by many European naturalists who first heard descriptions of it from Arctic explorers. It is a medium-sized whale, reaching lengths of up to 5.5 meters, that lives year-round in the high Arctic, primarily in Canadian and Greenlandic waters, ranging at times into the Beaufort Sea at the edge of Alaskan territory. Its defining feature is the tusk, a modified left canine tooth that spirals in a left-handed helix and grows to lengths of up to 3 meters in adult males. The tusk's function was debated for centuries. It was once assumed to be a weapon, used in combat with other males or with predators. It is now understood to be primarily a sensory organ, densely innervated with up to 10 million nerve endings that make it capable of detecting changes in water temperature, salinity, and possibly pressure. Male narwhals have been observed touching tusks in social interactions, a behavior that may facilitate the exchange of sensory information or serve as a display of condition. The narwhal is an animal that navigates its world partly through a tooth, an adaptation so specialized for the Arctic Ocean that it exists nowhere else and serves no function in any other environment. It is, in the most literal sense, an animal built by and for the ice. The beluga whale, Delphinapterus leucus, is the other iconic cetacean of Alaska's Arctic waters. and it differs from the narwhal in almost every respect except its dependence on the ice. Belugas are highly social, living in groups of dozens to hundreds of individuals. They are extraordinarily vocal, producing a repertoire of clicks, whistles, and calls that gave rise to their traditional nickname, the canaries of the sea. They are capable of echolocation and use it to navigate under ice and to locate prey in complete darkness. Their diet is broad, encompassing fish, squid, crabs, and other invertebrates. They are one of the few cetaceans that can swim backward, a capability that may be useful in the confined spaces beneath sea ice. And unlike most whales, their neck vertebrae are not fused, allowing them to move their heads in ways that other whales cannot, an adaptation that may facilitate foraging in tight spaces under ice or in shallow estuaries. The beluga's relationship with ice is different from the narwhals. Where narwhals stay in heavy pack ice year-round, belugas are more flexible, occupying a range of habitats from open water to dense ice depending on the season. In summer, large aggregations of belugas gather in shallow estuaries and coastal waters throughout Alaska, including Cook Inlet near Anchorage, the Beaufort Sea Coast, and Norton Sound. These aggregations are predictable enough that they have been the basis of subsistence hunting by Alaska Native communities for thousands of years, a relationship between humans and whales that is among the oldest and most continuously maintained human-wildlife interactions in North America. The beluga is not merely a biological species in Alaska's Arctic Ocean. It is a cultural and subsistence resource, woven into the history and identity of communities that have depended on it for generations and that continue to do so today. The darkness of the Arctic winter is absolute in a way that the darkness of the deep ocean is not. In the deep ocean, the darkness is permanent and unchanging. In the Arctic, it is seasonal, a 6-month night that gives way to a 6-month day with a brief twilight of weeks in between. This cycle of darkness and light, more extreme than anywhere else on Earth, has shaped the biology of every organism that lives in Alaska's Arctic waters in ways that go beyond the obvious. The metabolic cycles of Arctic organisms are tuned to the light cycle with a precision that has few parallels elsewhere. Copepods time their diapause to coincide with the declining light of autumn. Ice algae have photosynthetic machinery calibrated to work at light levels that occur only when the sun is at a low angle, filtering through meters of ice. Fish migration patterns are coordinated with the light cycle. Marine mammal breeding is timed to the light cycle. The Arctic Ocean is not merely a cold ocean. It is a precisely timed ocean, its biological calendar set by the angle of the sun and the presence or absence of ice, and every organism in it has been calibrated by millions of years of evolution to that calendar. When the calendar changes, as it is changing now, the calibration becomes misaligned, and the consequences cascade through the food web in ways that no single model can fully predict. The ice is the clock, and the clock is running differently than it has for millions of years. What is happening to Alaska's Arctic Ocean is not a future possibility. It is a present reality. The extent of summer sea ice in the Chukchi and Beaufort Seas has declined by more than 40% since satellite measurements began in 1979. The the thickness of the remaining ice has declined. The age distribution of the ice has shifted dramatically toward younger, thinner first-year ice and away from the older, thicker, multi-year ice that previously dominated the Arctic basin. The timing of sea ice formation in autumn has shifted later, and the timing of melt in spring has shifted earlier, compressing the ice season and expanding the open water period. These changes are not occurring uniformly or predictably. They interact with natural variability in ways that make specific predictions difficult. But the overall trajectory is clear, and the biological consequences are already visible in population trends for ice-dependent species. Alaska's Arctic Ocean is not disappearing. It is transforming into something that has not existed in the human record, and that the organisms currently living in it evolved over millions of years to avoid. What that transformation produces in the water and in the ice and in the food web that depends on both is the defining ecological question of the coming decades. And it begins not at the surface, but in the slow, cold chemistry of water that is still, for now, held in the ice. The under-ice world of Alaska's Arctic has one more inhabitant that deserves mention before we move deeper. One that sits at the intersection of the biological and the geological in a way that makes it unlike almost anything else in the Arctic system. The Arctic Ocean floor, beneath the shallow Beaufort and Chukchi seas, contains enormous deposits of methane hydrate, a form of methane ice that forms at the combination of high pressure and low temperature found in Arctic seafloor sediments. These hydrate deposits are the product of billions of years of accumulated organic matter decomposing in the sediment, producing methane that is trapped in a crystalline water lattice rather than released to the water column. As long as the sediment remains cold and the pressure remains high, the hydrates are stable. As the Arctic warms and the permafrost that underlies parts of the shallow Arctic seafloor thaws, some of those hydrates are destabilizing, releasing methane into the water column and potentially into the atmosphere above. The ecological consequences of methane seeps for the benthic communities of the Arctic shelf are still being studied. But methane seeps elsewhere in the ocean support chemosynthetic communities, bacteria, and the organisms that feed on them that depend on the methane as an energy source. Alaska's Arctic seafloor may be developing its own chemosynthetic ecosystems, driven not by hydrothermal activity, but by the thawing of ancient organic carbon stored in permafrost. It is an ecosystem that is being created by climate change, even as climate change destroys the ice-dependent ecosystems above it. The deep cold holds more than anyone expected. And some of what it holds is only now being released. The word frontier, in the American cultural imagination, implies the edge of the known, the boundary between the mapped and the unmapped, the settled and the wild. Alaska earned its designation as the last frontier, not because it is geographically at the edge of the continent, though it is, but because it was the last part of the continent to be systematically mapped, cataloged, and claimed by the expanding American state. That process of claiming, which began in earnest after the United States purchased the territory from Russia in 1867, is still incomplete in the marine domain. The ocean around Alaska is the largest uncharted frontier remaining in American waters. Large sections of the Bering Sea, the Gulf of Alaska, and the Arctic Ocean adjacent to Alaska have never been sampled at depth. The biological communities of the Aleutian Trench have barely been surveyed. The hydrothermal vent fields of the Arc are incompletely mapped. The deep waters of the Beaufort and Chukchi Seas have been studied primarily from the perspective of resource extraction, oil and gas, and fisheries, rather than from a systematic scientific interest in what lives there. The frontier in the ocean is not a metaphor. It is a literal absence of knowledge. What has been discovered in the limited surveys that have been conducted in Alaska's deep waters has been consistently surprising. New species are found on almost every expedition that targets unexplored seamounts or deep basins. New behaviors, new biological interactions, new physical processes are documented whenever researchers spend sufficient time in the water. The ocean around Alaska does not yield its contents easily. It is cold and rough and remote, and the vessels capable of operating in it under research conditions are few and expensive. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is responsible for much of the scientific surveying of American waters, has conducted expeditions to the Aleutian Arc and the Gulf of Alaska that have produced significant findings, including new records of cold water coral extent, new depth records for fish species, new documentation of hydrothermal activity. But the expeditions are infrequent and the coverage is sparse. For every seamount that has been visited, dozens have not. For every species described from Alaskan deep waters, there are likely others that remain undescribed. The commercial fishing industry has inadvertently contributed to the scientific understanding of Alaska's deep ocean in ways that would not have been possible through research expeditions alone. The bycatch of deep-water species in bottom trawl fisheries, though ecologically damaging, has delivered specimens to researchers that could not have been obtained otherwise. The Observer Program, which places trained observers on commercial fishing vessels to document catch composition, has produced an enormous dataset on the distribution and abundance of species throughout Alaskan waters, including many that would otherwise be unknown. The intersection of commercial fishing and scientific observation in Alaska's ocean is uncomfortable, because the fishing itself damages the ecosystems being documented, but the documentation has been essential to understanding the system well enough to manage it. It is one of the many contradictions of trying to know and to preserve an ocean that is simultaneously an economic resource and a scientific frontier. The indigenous knowledge of Alaska's coastal communities represents another dimension of understanding Alaska's ocean that Western science is only beginning to incorporate. Alaska Native peoples have been observing, using, and managing the marine resources of Alaskan waters for thousands of years, accumulating knowledge of species distributions, seasonal patterns, behavioral ecology, and environmental change that has no equivalent in the scientific record. The oral traditions and practical knowledge of communities like the Yupik, Inupiat, Alutiiq, and Unangan peoples contain observations that span generations, covering time periods and geographic areas that no scientific survey has ever sampled. This knowledge is not merely anecdotal. It is systematic, accumulated through generations of careful observation by people whose lives and survival depended on accurate understanding of the marine environment. Increasingly, marine scientists are working with Alaska Native communities to integrate traditional ecological knowledge into scientific research, using community observations to guide survey design, to validate model predictions, and to document changes that have occurred over timescales longer than the scientific record. The result is a richer and more accurate understanding of Alaska's ocean than either scientific or traditional knowledge could provide alone. The future of Alaska's ocean is a question that science and policy are only beginning to confront with the seriousness it demands. The changes that are already underway, the warming waters, the declining ice, the shifting distributions of species, the acidification of the surface ocean as it absorbs more atmospheric carbon dioxide, are happening faster than the management frameworks governing Alaska's fisheries were designed to accommodate. The Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act, which governs federal fisheries management in the United States, requires that fisheries be managed for maximum sustainable yield, a concept that assumes a reasonably stable environmental baseline. That baseline is no longer stable in Alaska. The pollock, that forms the basis of the largest fishery in American waters by volume, is moving northward as the Bering Sea warms. The crab populations that made Alaska famous are fluctuating dramatically. The salmon runs that support both commercial and subsistence fisheries throughout Alaska are responding to ocean conditions that have no historical precedent. Managing these resources in a changing ocean requires a fundamentally different approach from managing them in a stable one, and the transition to that different approach is uneven and contested. The Alaska Ocean that exists today, with its extraordinary biological richness, its still intact predator communities, its productive fisheries, and its vast unexplored deep waters, is the product of geological and biological processes that have been operating for tens of millions of years. The subduction of the Pacific Plate built the volcanoes and carved the trench and drove the upwelling that feeds the surface. The cold of the Arctic shaped the organisms that depend on ice. The seasonal extremes selected for the feast and famine strategies that produce organisms of extraordinary size and longevity. The biological abundance of the surface ocean fuels the communities of the deep, from the shelf bottom to the Haddle floor of the Aleutian Trench, in a continuous flow of organic matter that connects every depth to every other depth in a single integrated system. It is a system that has survived ice ages and warm periods and mass extinctions and the rise and fall of entire ocean circulation patterns. It is resilient in ways that are difficult to quantify and easy to underestimate. But it is not invulnerable. And what is happening to it now, in the decades since human industry began affecting the global climate system, is a test of that resilience on a timescale that is short by geological standards and long by human ones. The scientific instruments that have been deployed in Alaska's deep waters have returned data that has changed how oceanographers understand the North Pacific as a system. Moored current meters, bottom pressure recorders, autonomous underwater gliders, and satellite-tracked drifting buoys have collectively mapped the three-dimensional circulation of Alaska's ocean in greater detail than was possible a generation ago. What this mapping has revealed is a system of extraordinary dynamic complexity, with circulation patterns that vary on timescales from hours to decades, that interact with each other in ways that amplify and dampen biological productivity in different parts of the system at different times. The shelf break current that flows along the edge of the Bering Sea continental shelf, for example, interacts with the tides to produce pulses of upwelling that are not predictable from either the current or the tides alone. These pulses deliver nutrients to the surface at specific locations and times that concentrate biological productivity in ways that the fisheries have exploited intuitively for decades without understanding the physical mechanism. Understanding that mechanism allows better prediction of where and when productivity will be highest, which has implications for fisheries management, for conservation, and for the scientific study of how the system will respond to warming. The deep water of the Gulf of Alaska contains a record of environmental change that goes back centuries. The layered sediments on the floor of anoxic basins, where the absence of oxygen prevents the burrowing organisms that normally disrupt sediment layers, preserve annual records of productivity, temperature, and ocean chemistry in the form of varves, thin alternating bands of light and dark sediment corresponding to the seasonal cycle. Reading these varves requires extracting sediment cores and analyzing them with techniques that combine physical, chemical, and biological evidence. But the records they contain are invaluable because they extend the observable history of the ocean system far beyond the instrumental record. Cores from the Gulf of Alaska have documented the Little Ice Age, the medieval warm period, and variations in Pacific decadal oscillation going back to before European contact. They show that the current warming trend is exceptional in rate, if not necessarily in magnitude, compared to the natural variability of the past millennium. And they provide a context for the changes now underway that no amount of short-term instrumental data can supply. The floor of Alaska's ocean is an archive. It keeps the records that the surface forgets. The acoustic environment of Alaska's ocean is one of its least appreciated dimensions. Sound travels faster and farther in water than in air, and the ocean around Alaska is full of sound, both biological and physical. The calls of humpback whales carry hundreds of kilometers. The clicks of sperm whales foraging in the Gulf of Alaska are audible across the basin. The chorus of snapping shrimp in the shallow reefs creates a continuous crackling background noise. Earthquakes along the Aleutian Arc transmit low-frequency pulses through the water that are detectable thousands of kilometers away. The sea ice itself produces sounds as it forms and fractures and moves, a complex acoustic signature that has been used to monitor ice extent and thickness from hydrophone arrays. And beneath all of this natural acoustic environment, the sounds of human activity, ships, sonar, seismic air guns used in oil and gas exploration, have been increasing for decades, adding an anthropogenic layer to an acoustic world that was entirely natural until the 20th century. The biological consequences of this acoustic contamination for Alaska's marine mammals, which depend on sound for communication, navigation, and prey detection, are still being quantified. But the evidence from other ocean regions suggests that they are significant and persistent. The oceanography of the Aleutian Trench remains the largest gap in the scientific understanding of Alaska's deep ocean. The trench has been visited by research submersibles a handful of times. The organisms that live in its hadal zone are almost entirely unknown. The sediment that has been accumulating on its floor for millions of years, recording the history of the overlying ocean and the climate that drove it, has been sampled at only a few points. The chemical reactions occurring in its sediment, converting organic matter into inorganic compounds and cycling elements between the water column and the seafloor, have been measured almost nowhere. The Aleutian Trench is, by any reasonable measure, one of the largest unexplored environments on the surface of this planet, and it sits beneath some of the most productive and biologically important waters in the North Pacific. The disproportion between its ecological significance and its scientific documentation is one of the more striking examples of how little we actually know about the ocean we live on. What would it take to change that? A sustained program of deep-sea exploration targeting the Aleutian Trench, with multiple expeditions over multiple years, deploying full ocean depth landers, remotely operated vehicles capable of detailed biological and geological sampling, and a network of moored instruments to capture the physical oceanography of the trench environment, would cost a fraction of a single oil and gas exploration program in the same waters. The technology exists. The scientific questions are clear. What has been missing is the will to prioritize the knowledge of what the ocean contains over the extraction of what it yields. Alaska's ocean has been generating economic value for a century and a half, from the fur seal harvest that began immediately after the American purchase to the pollock fishery that is today one of the largest in the world. It has been generating scientific knowledge for a much shorter time and at a much smaller investment. The balance between these two uses of the same water is not fixed. It reflects choices about what matters, about what is worth knowing, about what kind of relationship with the ocean is sustainable over timescales longer than a single human career or a single fishing season. Alaska's ocean will be here long after the changes now underway have run their course. The ice will return in some form when the climate stabilizes. The volcanoes will continue to erupt. The trench will continue to deepen as the Pacific plate descends. The species that survive the transition to a warmer Arctic will be different from the ones that are here now, shaped by the new conditions as thoroughly as their predecessors were shaped by the old ones. The ocean is patient in a way that nothing else on Earth is patient. It has been here for more than 4 billion years. It has seen conditions far more extreme than anything human activity is likely to produce. It has produced life in circumstances that seemed to preclude it, maintained complexity through upheavals that seemed to preclude it, and returned to something close to its previous state after disruptions that seemed permanent. It does not need our understanding to continue. It does not need our protection to persist in some form for billions of years more. But the specific form that it takes in the next century, the richness or poverty of the communities that inhabit its depths and its shallows, the integrity or disruption of the food webs that have been building here since before the first human being stood on the shore and looked out at the water, that is something that will be determined, in part, by what we choose to do and not do in the time we have. Let that thought settle as you drift towards sleep now, into the cold and the quiet beneath the ice. into the deep water that moves so slowly it has been flowing since before Columbus sailed, into the darkness of Alaska's ocean, patient and vast and full of life that has never needed us to know it was there. It was always there. It will be there still, in the cold and the silence, long after tonight. If this journey moved something in you, consider subscribing to Sleep on Deep. Every week, we descend a little further. The ocean is waiting.